afternoon. My name is Aarathi Krishnan. I'm the Global Futures and Foresight Coordinator for the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. And a lot of you, or if not most of you, probably sat there thinking, what on earth is a Futures and Foresight Coordinator? Is that even a real job? So, I get asked that a lot, by the way. My role in the Red Cross is to look at how is the world changing, what is emerging over the next few decades that will likely impact not just civil society, but our role within civil society. Where will vulnerability exist? How might that change? How are the disruptions that are occurring all around us likely to impact on that? And so I want to talk you through some of that today as you are here convening to talk about volunteering and what is this going to look like over the next emerging decade. What do we know? We know that the future moves a lot faster than we expected. But are we actually good at spotting where the changes are occurring? Or are we, like most humanitarian NGOs, organizations, so caught up in doing the here and now that we don't have the capacity or the luxury to look up and see what is emerging and unfolding around us? So here's something really interesting. How long does it take to get to 50 million users? The television took 22 years to reach 50 million users. ATMs took 18 years. Mobile phones took 12 years. The internet took 7 years. Facebook took 4 years to get to 50 million users. Who played Pokemon Go last year? Do you remember Pokemon Go? The app that became really popular last year for like 2 weeks? Did anybody play it? Yeah, go on, put your hands up, you know you did. Yeah, I was chasing those Pokemons all over Geneva. For Pokemon Go to get to 50 million users took 19 days. That's how fast the pace of change is occurring. That's how quickly things are moving. That's how networked we all are. That's how distributed we all are. We have technologies that we don't even know what to do with. Gene editing technology, traditionally considered to be very expensive, only done in labs, only if you have a huge amount of grants available. CRISPR, which is a new, well, it isn't new, it's been around for a few years, but it's enabled gene editing technology to be done really cost efficiently and effectively, which means anybody can do that. What on earth does this have to do with volunteering? We live at a time where we had a water crisis in Cape Town in 2018. We have social movements that are entirely challenging the status quo. I'm sure we're all familiar with the Me Too movement. It's now getting traction in India, with ministers, celebrities in Bollywood being held to account. We have governments moving to e-programs, to e-residency programs. This is Estonia. And if you guys aren't familiar with them, do. They're incredibly innovative. What they are trialing is if you have a startup or a digital nomad, you can apply for a visa and essentially get e-residency in Estonia, and through that, access to the Shenzhen area. There's a poll that's done every year, a Gallup poll. They interviewed last year, they interviewed 154,000 people in 146 countries. Amongst all the change that's occurring at the moment, what they asked was, how tensed were you the day before? How stressed were you? Were you anxious? The level of anxiety that we as citizens are experiencing right now is at the highest level since 2006. We are more stressed, more anxious, more nervous than ever before. And at the same time of all of this, everything is changing in the digitized world. There was, 25,000 posts on Tumblr every 60 seconds. There's 87,000 hours of Netflix watched. Fair enough, I'm probably contributing to a lot of those. There's 18,000 matches on Tinder. Half of you are probably contributing to some of those. There's 400 hours of YouTube every 60 seconds. Saudi Arabia is now introducing women drivers for the first time. The Saudi Arabian equivalent of Uber, Careem, are training women drivers. Whether we like it or not, whether we stick our heads in the sand and pretend it's not happening, or if we are looking up and paying attention, the world is changing faster than we ever expected. The complexities of change, we're being pushed forward, and yet we're trying to solve 21st century problems with 19th century systems. You probably can't see this very clearly, but it's one of my favorite examples. Does anybody know what this is? It's a customs declaration form for the Apollo mission to the moon. I'm just gonna let that sink in for a wee bit. So these guys went to the freaking moon. And when they got back, government didn't know whether they should fill out a customs declaration form. So they made them fill out a customs declaration form. And if you can see it, what they've done, they've actually had to declare moon rock and moon dust samples. If the rate of change on the outside far exceeds the rate of change on the inside for all our organizations, the end is near. If you're talking about agility, if you're talking about innovation, if you're talking about understanding complexities of change, but the systems and processes that you have internally do not allow for that, it's just conversation. So we ask, are we prepared? Are we fit to serve the needs of future citizens and communities? Will what we have to offer be wanted and needed? An easy way for me to land this for myself in my own belly. If in 10 years my children or my parents needed to access social services, would they come to my organization? Or will they go to another organization that's more fit for purpose, that understands their needs better? Or are we going to continue to design programs like how we all have traditionally designed programs? This is a broad statement, but I'm making it, I'm owning it. If you can see what this is, someone's got the walkway. They've designed those black barriers, assuming that people are going to walk like this. And in fact, what people do, because we're rational, logical beings, is we walk around it. So do we design programs, do we design initiatives for how we assume people will behave rather than how they actually behave? How do we navigate and understand these increasingly complex times we live in? This is my favorite quote by John Wheeler. We shape the world by the questions we ask. So I'm asking, how is the world changing? And what does that mean for the types of services we offer, whether it's humanitarian action, whether it's development programming, whether it's domestic development programming, whether it's social services? I'm going to talk you through this very, very quickly, and I'm asking for your patience because I know it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon and I'm talking at you. We did a massive analysis on global trends and what is emerging in the world, not just now, but what might be popping up over the next decade that is likely to impact the world we live in. Now, I didn't want to just produce yet another report that said urbanization, climate change, migration. We all know those exist. We all know those are happening. The complexity of change that we are experiencing is that these issues are converging on each other at the same time and at a far faster pace than we're ready for. And so we converged down, and so these are 9 thematic areas of change. They're not meant to be all-encompassing. They're not meant to be finite. The point of this is that we have a continued process of scanning and of understanding, but here I present some thematic areas of change that we think are important. Violence and poverty. Whether it's prolonged civil conflict, whether it's nationalism, whether it's last-mile poverty, whether it's cyber violence. We know development standards are improving, but we also know that in the next decade, deep poverty will be concentrated in countries affected by fragility. But we're seeing different types of violence. Yeah, we're seeing hate crimes, fake news. There was a one-to-one correlation on, there was a correlation in Germany that when online hate speech occurred, it correlated with real-life violence. We saw an example of this in India a few months ago, where 2 gentlemen were named as being accused of sexual crimes, and their names went out on WhatsApp, a WhatsApp message. And it went far and wide. Now, if you're anything like my mom, who believes everything that she receives on WhatsApp, including every cure for cancer under the sun, this was the same level of trust taken by this WhatsApp message. The 2 men were lynched. They were found and they were lynched, but it was found out that it was not actually true. IFRC released a report this year that the future of conflict is going to be cyber, it's going to be urban, it's going to be autonomous weapon, and it's going to involve human modification. And we're seeing that already. I think as a country in Europe, that you can already implement like a scanner in your hand and then scan it for public transport. It's already occurring. Cyber warfare. Increasingly, we're getting hacked. We're seeing it happening. The NHS was ground to a halt earlier this year, I believe, and governments, Facebook, etc. What does that mean? Climate change, natural resources. I'm sure we're all familiar with the IPCC report released a few weeks ago. And in fact, what they're saying is that we shouldn't even be calling it climate change. We need to be calling it climate breakdown. That's the level, that's the extent of damage that's already occurring. This was by the Groundswell report, an excellent report for those of you that haven't picked it up yet. But what they're saying is that by 2050, we're going to have 86 million people dislocated in sub-Saharan Africa, 40 million in South Asia, 17 million in Latin America. These people are going to be on the move. This was in the Chiapas, where Coca-Cola purchased all the water so local residents, to produce their product, that local residents actually had to buy the water. I did some sessions in Sri Lanka with young people, and what they are concerned about, one of the many things they're concerned about, but what they are concerned about is actually commodification. They're being priced out of the products that they are producing, being priced out of tea. You're seeing this happen in Peru with quinoa, etc. The impacts of climate breakdown, impacts of natural resource commodification is very, very real for all of us. New communities, the very nature of community is changing. The assumptions that we have about who is Australian, or who is Kenyan, or who is Sri Lankan, or who is German, is vastly being challenged because there are so many people that are on the move. And it's not just a question of migration, it's about mobility. We have communities that have youth bulge. We have community societies that have an aging population. We have societies that are becoming increasingly urban. 244 million people live outside their country of birth. That's 3% of humanity, and most of us here, I would assume. 2.5 billion people will be added to the world's population by 2050. The majority of that is going to be in Asia and Africa. We know that there's a trend for urbanization. We know the stresses that that's going to put on cities' systems. But it also gives rise to informal settlements. 1 in 3 people will be living in informal settlements over the next decade. We know that inequality is not decreasing, it's actually increasing. This makes me sick to my stomach, but in 2017, the world's 8 richest people had the same wealth as the poorest 50%. And of course, online communities. Who it is we connect, where do we go to for our support systems, how do we engage with them? That's completely different. I live in an apartment in Geneva. I think I know 2 of my neighbors, and that's it. My friends, yes, my workmates, but also they're my online friends that's how I keep in touch with my friends and family all over the world, because most of us are the same. Financing. We know this. There's lesser and lesser money to do what we need. We know that humanitarian financing fell short by 38%, aid to least developed countries fell by 3.9% in 2015 alone. We're going to need $2.5 trillion to achieve the SDGs. That seems almost impossible. And so there are other alternate sources of capital, other alternate sources of fundraising, whether it's mobile money, impact investments, but a lot of our organizations don't yet know how to do this, how to engage with this. But we can't keep on doing our work assuming that the same amount of financing is going to continue. Power, governance, where does it exist? Who has it? Is it still the nation-state system? Is that changing? Who actually is having power? Who's having influence? We know the rise of different types of power. China's One Belt, One Road initiative is also seeing them moving into humanitarian assistance in Africa. There's a lot of conversation around whether our governments are moving to more Big Brother type surveillance systems. This is something being done now in China. For those of you, have any of you heard of the social credit system in China? Yeah? So essentially, for those that don't, you're assigned a credit score for everything. Whether you pay your traffic fines on time, whether you pay your loans on time, etc., etc. And that credit score does then determine whether you can get a house, whether you can get a job. The US pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. 350 mayors adopted it after. The increasing power of cities is far more influential. Denmark appointed its first ambassador to Silicon Valley. I didn't believe this when I first heard it, but they've appointed an ambassador to Silicon Valley because they noted that that is where decisions are being made, where influence is starting from. This was a report that was done in the UK, on the UK civil society, but there is so much correlation for civil society around the world. And essentially, this probably won't be a surprise to you, but that citizens are increasingly distrustful of institutions and of governments. Work, how is the nature of work evolving? 65% of primary age school students today will be in jobs that don't yet exist. How many of you have kids in primary school? How many of them want to be Instagram influencers? Which, honestly, I have no idea how that's a job, but apparently it is. But when we are talking about how we prepare young people for the future, are we thinking about the types of future skill sets that they might need? 34% of young women globally are not in employment, education, or training. 54% of them live in Southern Asia. This was an initiative done by Green Robotics. For those of you who don't know them, they are a flying lab. They train people on how to fly drones for humanitarian action. And they started to look at, well, as opposed to just running another training program, or if we were to use drones when a disaster happened and flying in experts, why don't we train young schoolgirls in Fiji how to do it? So that we're not flying in international responders, international volunteers, we can mobilize what's already happening locally. The World Economic Forum released this report maybe 3 weeks ago, talking about the jobs landscape in 2022. What is decreasing? Accountants, general ops managers, data entry clerks, accounting, bookkeeping. What is emerging? Data analysts and scientists, AI and machine learning, big data, digital transformation, organizational development specialists. So when we think about the types of training programs we're offering young people, are we preparing them for these types of futures? We're more at risk than ever of a global pandemic. It costs, I think, 504, a moderate to severe pandemic costs about $504 billion. We're not ready for an aging population. Our systems are not ready for it. Our hospital systems are not ready for it. Our social care systems are not ready for it. We're going to be a shortage of health workers by 18 million by 2030. And health needs are going to increase. We're almost at the end. I didn't want to we can't have a conversation about the future without having a conversation about technology and innovation. I didn't want to put it up front because I didn't want the conversation to be led by tech and innovation. But the reality is, it drives a lot of the changes we see. This is a AIDR, which is a platform. The picture isn't very good, but essentially it maps social media messages after a disaster, and you're able to check it straight away and see what those messages are saying. In Indonesia, there's a fantastic organization called Bencana, and what they do, so Indonesia has got one of the highest proliferation rates for Twitter. It also gets a high amount of floods, as we know. What they found is that citizens weren't listening to what the governments were saying, or that the information wasn't coming up fast, or it wasn't necessarily accurate. But people were posting it on Twitter. Don't go down this road, don't go down that road, such and such has happened here. If you need support, go to this place. And they were tagging it. So Bencana now collates all the data and pushes it out so that citizens can know and get the most up-to-date information about what to do during a flood or during a disaster. Blockchain. I'm sure most of us here have heard about blockchain. Blockchain is going to save the world. For all reports it is, but that's fundamentally reshaping whether you like it, you're a believer, not a believer, we're having the conversation. This is Brian Gita. He's 24 years old. He just won a huge innovation award because he designed an innovation that's able to detect malaria by shining a light on your index finger. Where innovations are occurring, where solutions and new solutions are being found, isn't in the traditional spaces we assume it to be. It's changing. It's occurring in the communities we work in by the people that live there. So how do we amplify that? Again, artificial intelligence is seen to be changing the world. But some of the concerns around artificial intelligence are values. Is it going to promote a neo-colonialistic approach? Is it, if you had to decide between killing a child, a dog, or an old person, how is it going to make that decision? Last one, and this is the most relevant one for volunteering. Participation. This is a report done by the Global Report on Volunteering, done by the Red Cross and Red Crescent in 2015. It's a public report, so I can definitely put this up here. Essentially what it's saying is that to become a volunteer with Red Cross, it takes about 4 months. You've got to sign up, you've got to go for the training, you've got to fill in your medical check, your police clearance, etc., and then you might get a job or a posting or an assignment. It may or may not fit with what you want to do. The whole process takes about 4 months, and yet someone can sit on their couch and be signed up straight away to an online volunteering model. We run traditionally a hierarchical, structured volunteering model. And so we are grappling and thinking about what kind of models do we need to move to for citizen-led engagement, for faster volunteering. After the Mexico City earthquake last year, citizens self-mobilized, and we're seeing, as you guys all know, huge amounts of examples of this. And in fact, a report done after that earthquake found that the citizen-led response was a lot more effective than the government or responses by institutions. activism is changing. Coming back to my point earlier about social movements. The gun debate in the United States, yes, it's been going on for a long time, but young people took over that earlier this year, and it's gotten a lot further than it ever has. The conversations, the narrative, the status quo are being challenged. So my overarching question for you, what is the future of volunteering over the next 10 years? Any questions? Okay, so that was really quick. I usually have a lot more time, but I tried to summarize it down. But I'm going to get you guys to do some work right now. So do you have your apps? As Alex said, the first time I'm going to be asking people to take out their phones. Okay. I'm going to do a bit of Futures 101 with you. What's the difference between a trend and an emerging issue? Now, most of us that have run written strategies, operational plans, any sort of strategic document of any sort, if we're good at what we do, we would have done some level of trend analysis. And often that would involve looking backwards to see what has occurred and looking at the patterns of that. And that's fine, that's important. It's also important for us to look at what is happening now at the global, regional, local level. What is driving the change? Is it just technology, or is it about the way people want to connect? Is it just AI, or are people living in very different ways that need a different type of effectiveness that we haven't considered before? Emerging issues is a little bit more difficult. Trends, you're going to have a lot of data. Emerging issues are your crispers, are the things that you're seeing bubbling up that hasn't actually gotten traction yet, but you're starting to see it. This is what you mine Twitter for, this is what you're reading blogs for, this is what you're doing your networking for. What is slowly getting traction? Some of you might have organizations that have scanning departments, and essentially, these roles like mine are constantly scanning to see what might be emerging, what might impact on us. And the reason we do this, the number one reason, because the assumptions we make about what the future will hold is not necessarily true. We tend to assume that what has come before will be what will emerge. And it's really difficult for us to completely reimagine a future that looks drastically different to what we're used to. But I remind you again about the pace of change and how quickly things are emerging. Think about if 10 years ago, I'm betting everybody in this room's got pretty much everybody in this room's got a smartphone. Yep, how many of you checked your emails on your smartphone today? Okay, 10 years ago, would you have done that? 10 years ago, I had a big Nokia. I thought I was cool. But that was 10 years ago, and look at what we're able to do today on a smartphone. So what has come before doesn't necessarily necessitate what might emerge. The assumptions we have about our status quo, who it is we serve, the types of communities we're going to be living in, does not necessarily hold. So, on your app, I'm going to ask for some help from our IT experts here to make sure I'm explaining it correctly. If you go to the agenda and you choose this session, so you have to choose Thursday, I think we're at 4:15, Futures of Volunteering. Oh, okay. Alex is going to explain this to you.
Hi there. Just if you cannot find the app in your app store, it's called S-Event app, and please, please use the web browser, so it's s-eventapp.plus.net, and there you can use, if your email address is not working, please use john.doe@, and the code is WYC2018, and then you can take part in the voting.
So, and I think you choose today's session, click on that, so it should be Wednesday, 18th of October, Futures of Volunteering, click on that. If you're there yet, are you there yet? Yeah? Okay. And there should be a button for voting. Now, in your groups, you're kind of positioned in groups. If you're in a very large group, I suggest either moving to a group with less than 8 people. If you're in a very small group, please move to a larger group. I want you to have a discussion, a debate, fight it out. I have listed 10 trends on there. They're very broad. But I want you to have a discussion, a debate, fight it out about what you think are the top 5 most prevalent issues that are going to impact volunteering over the next decade. So not just today, but 4 years from now, 6 years from now, 8 years from now, 10 years from now. And as a group, I want you to choose the top 5, and then you just vote for it. When you click next, you have an opportunity to list anything that you think is also important but wasn't on that list. I just listed 10. There's going to be loads more that I haven't listed there, of course. So if there's anything there that you feel this is really important, this is what we should be paying attention to, you have a chance to write it down. The next one, when you click on next, comes to your final question. I don't just want you to decide or vote or have a conversation about whether you think distrust in institutions is going to be a prevailing issue for volunteering. I want you to think about what is the likely impact of that. Does that make sense? Are we ready to give it a go? Great. Okay, so you've got 20 minutes to do this. Just decide the top 5 and then work through the next 2 questions. And we're going to walk around and make sure that you guys are okay. We're going to do a quick analysis of that data tonight, and I'll report back on that first thing tomorrow morning. So back to the 9 a.m. session tomorrow morning. I think this is the first session that we've used the app to vote for, and I just want to give a huge round of applause to Alex, who has designed the app. And he's been frantically running around trying to sort it out. So we learn as we go, but huge effort. So that's Futures 101, a quick introduction to how we understand our perspectives, the diversity of our opinion. It's not to say one is less important than the other, but how do we prioritize it? And more importantly, what is the implication of it? Because if we want to change an existing imagined order, we must first believe that an alternative is possible. And the reason we do Futures and Foresight work is so that we can give everybody the ability to create, act upon, and be part of the emerging futures, that we're really not leaving anybody behind. May you live in interesting times. I'm going to thank you for listening to me for the last hour and for leaning in and participating. I hope you found that interesting. And I'm going to hand over to my esteemed colleague, Morley from UNV, who's going to talk about their amazing new report that's just been released. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aarathi, for a really interesting and stimulating conversation on the futures of volunteering. Aarathi made the distinction between trends and emerging issues. And what I'm going to do for a few minutes is talk about UNV's latest report. So every 3 years, United Nations Volunteers produces a research report called The State of the World's Volunteerism. And what we do is pick a theme and look at the recent trends. So this report here, which is called The Thread That Binds, Volunteerism and Community Resilience, was launched in July this year in New York. And what it does is looks at global trends in volunteerism and how it links to community resilience. I'm going to address 4 issues. First of all, we have facts and figures on the scope and scale of global volunteering. We're going to look at global trends in volunteering. Thirdly, look at volunteerism in the context of resilience. And fourthly, how can volunteerism adapt to help communities more resilient to future shocks and challenges, some of the challenges and trends that Aarathi talked about. So first of all, what is the scope and scale of global volunteering? And I've heard a lot during my last day here at IAVE about the need for measurement, the need for data, and really, let's be realistic, there's a lot of data gaps. And getting accurate data on volunteerism, measuring the scope of volunteerism, and looking at its impact is very complex. But our report presents for the first time the most comprehensive global estimates to date using the data developed from the national statistical agencies in your own countries. Our analysis shows that the efforts of more than 1 billion volunteers are equal to that of 109 million full-time workers. What that means in practice is that 1 billion people volunteer, but not everyone volunteers on a full-time scale. So that equates to 109 million people. To put this into context, the global volunteer workforce is nearly 3 times the number employed globally in financial services and more than 5 times those working in mining and extractive industries. We also know that the vast majority of volunteer work, 70% of volunteer work, does not involve organizations. It happens directly between people in their communities. So the majority of volunteering is informal. And globally, women take on the majority of volunteer work at 57%. But when we look at the gender dimensions of formal and informal volunteering, we discover that formal volunteering is more evenly distributed between the sexes than informal volunteering. And 51% of formal volunteering is done by women. And in terms of informal volunteering, women take on 59%. What are the global trends that we're seeing in volunteerism? First, perhaps unsurprisingly, volunteerism is universal, and people of all ages and backgrounds volunteer. But the types of volunteer opportunities really depend and differ by your nationality, by your income, by your gender, and by your social status. Not all volunteering opportunities are equal to all. Many countries with aging populations are finding new resources and challenges for volunteering. Similarly, increasingly, countries with youth populations, especially in Africa, are emphasizing volunteerism as a means of constructively engaging young people. In some countries, formal volunteering is becoming more episodic than the regular and predictable volunteering of the past. It's influenced by factors such as work and leisure. People perhaps don't have the time now to go and volunteer for a day, a week, a month, but they'll do an hour here, an hour next week. And of course, the rapid rise of technology, smartphones, crowdsourcing methodologies, and other new technologies continue to bring changes to volunteerism and how volunteers and voluntary organizations change. So what does the State of the World's Volunteerism Report tell us about volunteerism in the context of resilience? We conducted field research in 15 communities across the world, and communities told us that volunteering has 2 distinctive features that enables them to cope with the shocks and stresses of the modern world. Firstly, volunteerism gives people the ability to self-organize around their own priorities. And we talked about distrust in institutions. And in times when trust in institutions is low and failing, this is an important way for people to demonstrate their agency and to express their own autonomy and activism in issues that are important to them. Secondly, by its nature, volunteerism is formed around human connections. People like to volunteer because they get solidarity, empathy, and connections generated through social action. And these are a protective factor when people or communities are under shock or stress. I think what is most important about these two characteristics, which we found through our field research, is that in all communities, volunteerism was about us and not them. The vast majority were working day in, day out in their own communities. This is a side that we hear less about. Not about international people going overseas to volunteer. So it's more about the trend about volunteerism is local, about our community. So how can volunteerism adapt to help communities more resilient, to make communities more resilient to future shocks and challenges? In this session today, we've talked about the speed of change that is unfolding in the world today, the emerging global trends and the challenges that we face going forward, climate change, insecurity, technology. We know that volunteers are at the forefront of every response to conflict, natural disasters, and other acute shocks. From the response to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, to the response to the rapid increase in migration in Europe, to climate change events, volunteers are always there. They're some of the first people who are on the scene. We need to recognize that diverse volunteers often step in when state actors and formal organizations are often hindered by political and bureaucratic changes. Many external actors draw on local volunteerism, directly or indirectly. But when actors engage with local volunteerism purely as a cheap and readily available resource, local volunteering and community resilience may be undermined. The recommendations from the State of the World Volunteerism Report provide an indication of some of the changes or shifts needed if volunteerism is to adapt to the future and maximize its potential as a global public good. First of all, policies and practice need to focus on ensuring both mutually reinforcing volunteering for resilience and resilient volunteering. This enables external support to maximize the benefits while reducing harm. Concretely, governments, civil society, and partners should focus on 4 issues: building national, regional, and continental infrastructure for volunteerism that enables all citizens to contribute, including young people out of employment and education, young women and girls. This includes the space for people to self-organize around their own priorities. Secondly, we need to ensure a fairer distribution of resources, allocating resources to communities that are bearing the brunt of risk and making sure that people have a say in how those resources are used. Thirdly, integrating volunteerism into national resilience strategies and plans, giving volunteers a voice in decision-making based on their own contributions. And finally, and probably most importantly, ensuring that volunteering happens in a fairer way, including creating development and leadership opportunities through volunteering for marginalized groups. Under the 2030 Agenda, developed by member states at the United Nations, we look to address development challenges and to engage those furthest behind to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. The findings from the State of the World's Volunteerism Report, The Thread That Binds, show that volunteers are an important resource to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. With the right investment, support, and leadership opportunities, volunteers can help strengthen social cohesion and create innovative solutions to the problems of our time. Finally, the Secretary General's Plan of Action for Volunteerism for the 2030 Agenda. This is a plan of action which looks at how volunteerism can contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. It sets out processes and platforms for us all to come together. The plan of action calls for concerted action from member states, civil society, volunteer involving organizations, academia, and the private sector. A true partnership. Under the plan of action, there is a global technical meeting in 2020 which will focus on the future of volunteerism under the heading of Reimagining Volunteerism for the 2030 Agenda. It will bring together from the north, from the south, from the east and west, the United Nations, volunteer involving organizations, private sector, academia, to share experiences, lessons learned, and most importantly, evidence on how volunteerism could be an effective and adaptable resource for member states to draw upon when adapting to the new future and the challenges of reaching the Sustainable Development Goals, including, most importantly, the people who are currently left behind and the people who are hard to reach. On behalf of the United Nations volunteers and in conjunction with our partner, IFRC, we look forward to continuing this important conversation on volunteerism for the SDGs in our new, challenging and very uncertain future. Thank you.